Private Logs, Petty Officer First Class Mac McGuffey, September 30th, 2019. The chill of the morning was biting as we set off just after 5, the sun already peaking above a bleak, overcast horizon. The sea was a tumultuous mix of dark, choppy waves reflecting the mood that hung over us. The USS Barry and the PTSD cutter, our reluctant companions, were anchored a half-mile from the eerie Noni. The grotesque garden of mushrooms and mold that had clung to its hull seemed to have vanished, either drifting away or sinking into the depths as night gave way to day. Raindrops fell from the sullen sky, cold and relentless, as our boat sped towards the Noni. Right from the start, I felt a sense of foreboding. The wall of fog that shrouded the tanker hadn't budged since yesterday. The Noni loomed ominously at the edge of this fog, its massive, dark shape a stark and unnerving contrast against the swirling gray. It was like something straight out of a horror movie. Captain Diomedes wasn't taking any chances this time. In addition to our usual visit board search and seizure (VBSS) team, he had called in the big guns, a full Marine Rapid Force (MRF) team stationed on our ship. I reckon the captain was still reeling from the loss of our own and the sailors who had jumped ship in panic during the collision. 16 of our crew were missing, including Lieutenant Riggs. It was odd. Riggs had been right beside me before the Noni rammed into us, and then he was just gone. 4 boats from the Barry made their way to the Noni. The first 2 carried a platoon of Marines each, 16 in each boat. These guys were itching for action, trapped in the confines of the ship like caged animals waiting to be unleashed. Then there were the other 2 boats, carrying members of our VBSS team, including myself. We were there for medical backup and fire support, but honestly it felt like we were walking into an unknown abyss. In my boat, it was Spoonie, Petty Officer First Class Greta Thompson, Petty Officer Second Class Boris Yannick, and Staff Sergeant Alden, that tough-as-nails Marine. We weren't medics. Thompson and Yannick had that covered. The Russians were making their own approach on the port and starboard, but given the size of the tanker, coordinating with them felt like an impossible task. As we approached, the ghastly sight of bodies strapped to the hull grew more visible and even more unsettling than the day before. Some bodies looked grotesquely bloated, their stomachs distended in a way that made my stomach churn. Greta muttered something about the sheer insanity of hanging all those bodies, wondering aloud how anyone could even accomplish such a feat. I just shook my head, unable to comprehend the scale of this horror. Suddenly our radio crackled to life. It wasn't from any of our teams, but an old man's voice, frail yet strong, preaching some sermon. This wasn't just bizarre, it was downright disturbing, especially given that it was coming through on what was supposed to be a secure military channel. His words were accompanied by an unsettling buzzing sound, as if he were surrounded by a swarm of flies. "We're about 30 yards out now," I mumbled, trying to focus as the Noni's nightmarish masts came into view, adorned with dozens of swaying corpses. The sermon continued, the old man's voice growing stronger, speaking of architects of life and false prophets. It was pure madness. Spoonie and I exchanged glances, both of us uneasy. Alden, trying to maintain some semblance of control, ordered us to switch channels, to reach out to Lieutenant Brisby's team. But it was no use. That eerie sermon and the droning buzz followed us, hopping from channel to channel, a relentless auditory phantom haunting our advance. As we closed in on the Noni, the old man's voice took on a sing-song quality, his words becoming more cryptic and unsettling. The buzzing intensified, resonating with an almost tangible presence. It dawned on us that we were no longer just on a recovery mission. We were stepping into a narrative that seemed to transcend the physical world, a tale spun from the depths of madness and the sea. Petty Officer First Class Mac McGuffey, September 30th, 2019. The morning was frigid, with the sun barely piercing the dense overcast sky. The sea around us was a dark, tumultuous mass, and the USS Barry and the PTSD cutter sat anchored about a half-mile from the menacing silhouette of the Nonni. The previous day's grotesque display of mushrooms and mold had mostly vanished, probably having sunk to the sea's mysterious depths during the night. Rain fell steadily from the gray heavens as we made our approach towards the Noni. There was an unsettling feeling in the air, a sense that something wasn't right. A thick fog had stubbornly clung to the area since the previous day, and the Noni loomed menacingly at its edge. Its large, dark form stood out sharply against the swirling grayness. It was the stuff of horror movies, and we were headed straight into it. Captain Diomedes had decided on a full-force approach, involving not just our VBSS team, but also a Marine Rapid Force (MRF) stationed on our ship. The captain was likely feeling the weight of the lives lost and those who had jumped ship in panic after the collision. There were still 16 of our crew unaccounted for, including Lieutenant Riggs, who had vanished right next to me when the Noni struck us. 4 boats from the Barry headed towards the Noni. The first 2 carried full platoons of Marines. They'd been stationed with us for nearly 3 months, and the anticipation of action was evident in their demeanor. The other 2 boats, one of which I was in, consisted of our VBSS team. We were tasked with medical backup and fire support. The Russians had deployed their own teams to the port and starboard sides of the Noni. But considering the tanker's immense size, it was as if they were on a completely different vessel. As we neared the Noni, the horror of the bodies attached to its hull became even more apparent. The methods used to hang the corpses varied from rusty chains and meat hooks to nails. Some bodies were not attached to the hull directly, but dangled grotesquely from hooks that had been hammered into the decaying steel. The shadow cast by the colossal tanker enveloped us in a chilling cold, and looking up at its towering structure gave me a sense of vertigo. Our ships came to a stop close to the hull, only about 10 meters apart. From this proximity, the damage to the Noni was starkly visible. The areas where the steel had rotted through were even more evident, and the holes from our previous day's firefight were brutally obvious. The ship looked like it should have sunk long ago, defying the very laws of physics by remaining afloat. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, my eyes scanning the lifeless bodies and expecting at any moment for one to meet my gaze. Our attention was suddenly brought back to the mission at hand when the tail gunners of Emrys's team fired their grappling hooks. The Marines ascended the hull with a speed and agility that was almost superhuman, clambering over the dead as they went. Once they reached the top, they disappeared from our view, and a tense silence hung over us as we waited for any sign of what was happening. A few minutes later, 2 rope ladders were thrown over the side for our team to ascend. As we prepared to climb, Alden directed myself, Spoonie, and Thompson to remain on guard duty. I was somewhat relieved. Climbing up a rope ladder while dodging corpses was not how I envisioned my day going. As we stood guard, the eerie quiet was shattered when a corpse, loosened from its moorings, tumbled through a hole in the hull. The sight was unnerving, the flesh tearing away and leaving tattered remnants in its wake. Greta suggested shining a light inside to see what lay beyond. Despite my apprehensions, I couldn't argue with her logic. With an LED spotlight in hand, Greta illuminated the darkness within the Noni, and what we saw made our blood run cold. The interior seemed hollow at first, but a few meters in, there was a barrier that was unlike anything we had ever seen. It was an organic wall, seemingly alive, rigid, and bumpy, stretching out as far as our light could reveal. It bore the same rotten strawberry hue as the mushrooms from the day before. The sight of it was enough to send shivers down our spines, a grotesque reminder that we were dealing with something beyond our comprehension. We stood there, struck dumb, our eyes fixated on the bizarre spectacle before us. The strange organic wall on the Noni's interior, with its 2 ridges running down the middle, started to pulsate. One ridge shot upwards into the darkness, while the other plummeted down. We found ourselves staring into a massive, milky white eye, embedded within the rotten strawberry flesh of the wall. The sheer size of it made the air around us vibrate with its movement. We instinctively ducked down, pressing against the wall of the flying bridge, our hearts pounding in our chests. "Oh, Jesus," Spoonie whispered, his voice barely a breath in the tense atmosphere. Nobody responded to his comment. We were all too absorbed in the shock of what we were witnessing. The eye, milky white and as large as a school bus, continued its unsettling motion, sending ripples of terror through the air. Greta tried to break the silence, suggesting we radio the others, but her words were quickly shot down. The eerie sermon that had been broadcasting on our frequencies earlier came back to mind, a grim reminder of the bizarre situation we found ourselves in. "Oh shit," I muttered, remembering that any attempt to communicate would likely be drowned out by that nightmare-inducing sermon. "What the hell do we do?" Spoon asked, his voice laden with a mix of fear and disbelief. I half-jokingly suggested that this was all a nightmare, a feeble attempt to make sense of the surreal situation we were in. But Spoonie shot down that notion quickly, his eyes wide with terror. "It's not a nightmare," he said. And I knew he was right. Everything went still then, the air no longer vibrating with the eye's movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, its gaze possibly fixed upon our small, insignificant forms huddled against the bridge wall. Greta finally broke the paralysis, whispering that we needed to get the others and get out of there. Spoonie agreed, his voice a hiss of dread. "I told you this was going to go tits up," he muttered, a statement that Greta sharply rebuked. So, we began to move, silently and cautiously. I climbed up the ladder first, followed by Greta, and then Spoonie. The Marines on their boats watched us with visible confusion. One started to shout, but Greta quickly silenced him with a gesture. It was clear they knew the radio frequencies were compromised. Climbing past the gaping hole in the hull was terrifying. My heart felt like it was trying to burst through my chest as I carefully navigated past the jagged metal, only inches away from my body. The corpses hanging from the hull made the climb even more challenging. One body in particular caught my attention, a man in his mid-40s wearing the tattered remnants of a white sailor's uniform. His dead, milky white eyes and ear-to-ear grin were deeply unsettling. I couldn't help but glance at the other bodies, wondering if they all shared that same eerie smile. As we climbed, a strong gust of wind nearly knocked me off the ladder. I clung on for dear life, my feet dangling precariously over the open air. Finally, the wind relented, and I was able to regain my footing and continue the climb. Reaching the top, we pulled ourselves over the wall and onto the lower deck, catching our breath after the harrowing ascent. The deck wasn't as horrendous as the hull, but it was clear that it had been neglected for a long time. Bird droppings and unidentified liquids pooled in the depressions of the steel deck. Ahead of us lay the rest of the tanker, including the bridge, which loomed like a distant fortress. We moved quickly and quietly toward the nearest building, giving a wide berth to one of the masts that was continuously bombarded with bird droppings. As we advanced, the only sounds were the cries of seagulls and the distant lap of water far below. The deck was stained with large brown patches which I instinctively knew were dried blood, evidence of some terrible massacre. We spotted Sergeant Alden and Yannick through the windows of the first building. They seemed engrossed in something, oblivious to our approach. The rest of the Marines were out of sight. We entered the building, a large open space divided by a long counter. Alden and Yannick were fiddling with a radio, static pouring from its speakers. "Why aren't you with the boat?" Alden asked, not looking up. His voice was devoid of its usual force, tinged with fear. The old man's sermon had finally concluded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. We were now faced with the daunting task of figuring out our next move amidst the chilling reality of the Noni and the unknown horrors it harbored. Sergeant Alden was at the computer, his focus intense as he tried to wrestle some sense out of our dire situation. "We've got to get off this ship," I said, urgency heavy in my voice. Alden's response was laced with sarcasm and frustration. "Yeah, no kidding." He was tapping away, trying to establish some form of communication, but it was clear that every frequency was jammed, and there was no reaching the berry. He mentioned something about a corpse garden in the back, which caught my attention, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know more. "Just take a look for yourself," Alden said, gesturing vaguely towards the back. The Devil Dogs, our marine team, were already conducting a recon in that direction. Spoonie chimed in with his observation that there was something even more bizarre than the corpse-filled garden. Alden finally looked up from his keyboard, repeating Spoonie's words with a mix of incredulity and confusion. I tried to explain, but Alden cut me off, clearly thinking we'd lost our minds amidst the horror of the Nonni. Standing up, he declared the situation out of our control, and that it was time to abandon the ship. A soft, rhythmic thumping sound then began to echo up from deep within the bowels of the ship. We all fell silent, our eyes involuntarily drawn to the floor from where the sound emanated. It was a heartbeat, the pulsing core of this diseased leviathan. Greta spoke up, her voice grave. "It's the black heart of the beast." Alden's realization that we were not concocting tales of madness was written across his pale face. Alden stood abruptly, announcing that we were leaving immediately. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a clear desire to flee from this nightmare. He instructed Yana to follow, leaving us with a final, desperate look before exiting. Once he was gone, Spoonie shook his head in disbelief. Greta insisted we couldn't abandon the others, but Alden's only concern was making it back to our boat. We decided to check the back entrance of the building, moving through what appeared to be an impromptu medical bay littered with medical waste. Among the debris, I noticed a strange symbol painted on the back wall in what looked like dried blood. Its design was unsettling, and I felt inexplicably drawn to it. In the midst of this grim scene, my attention was captured by an unopened bottle of oxy. The temptation was almost overwhelming, but the urgency of our situation snapped me back to reality. I quickly rejoined my team, and we exited the makeshift med bay. Outside, we were met with an even more bizarre sight, a makeshift farm. Just a few feet from the door, a hill of soil stretched out on either side, reaching the walls of the deck. Despite the strangeness of finding fertile soil aboard the ship, it appeared normal, a stark contrast to the decay surrounding us. Spoonie remarked on the absurdity of the situation, but his words were cut short as we reached the top of the soil mound. Before us lay rows of bodies in various stages of decay and dissection, as if they had been part of some twisted scientific experiment or ritual. The precision of the incisions suggested a methodical, almost surgical approach to their mutilation. Flies and maggots swarmed over the bodies, particularly around the surgical wounds. It was as if the cuts were accelerating the decomposition process, creating a morbidly efficient system for the vermin to thrive. The sight was horrifying, yet I couldn't help but notice the meticulous nature of the incisions, which seemed almost to aid the natural process of decay. Moving cautiously, we continued toward the first building, navigating through the surreal landscape of death and decay. The air was filled with the buzzing of flies and the distant sound of the ocean, a reminder of the isolation of our grim surroundings. As we approached the building, we prepared to face whatever other horrors the Noni held within its rusting walls. Sergeant Alden seemed almost resigned to our fate aboard this cursed vessel. "We have to get off this ship," I insisted, but his response was tinged with a dry, sarcastic undertone. He had been trying desperately to establish some form of contact with the berry, but every attempt was futile. Our communications were thoroughly compromised. Intrigued and apprehensive, I inquired about the corpse garden he mentioned. Alden simply gestured towards the back of the ship, where the Marines were conducting their recon. The very thought of it sent shivers down my spine. Spoonie, his voice unsteady, added that there was something even more disturbing than the garden itself. Alden finally paused and looked up at us, skepticism written all over his face. When we tried to explain, he cut us off, clearly thinking our sanity had slipped in the face of the nightmarish reality aboard the Noni. But then, a soft, rhythmic pounding began to echo from the depths of the ship. The sound was like a heartbeat, emanating from somewhere deep within the vessel's corroded belly. The realization hit us all at once. The ship was alive in some grotesque, unimaginable way. Greta voiced what we were all thinking. It's the black heart of the beast. Alden, finally grasping the gravity of our situation, declared we were leaving immediately. His usual confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by a palpable sense of urgency and fear. He instructed Yannick to follow him, leaving us to decide our next course of action. Once they were gone, Spoonie shook his head in disbelief. Greta, resolute and determined, insisted we couldn't just leave the rest behind. Alden, already halfway to the exit, gave us a final look of desperation before disappearing from the room. We quickly decided to move to the back entrance. The room we had just crossed seemed to have been used as an impromptu medical bay, with medical supplies scattered all over. Amid the chaos, a bizarre symbol was drawn on the back wall in dried blood. The sight of it was disturbing, and I felt a strange pull towards it, but I managed to tear my gaze away. Then, to my shock and dismay, I spotted an unopened bottle of oxy. The temptation was overwhelming, but the urgency of our predicament pulled me back to reality. I left it behind, joining my teammates as we exited the med bay. Outside, we were greeted by a sight that defied belief. Just beyond the door was a hill of soil, part of a makeshift farm stretching out on either side. It was surreal to find such a scene aboard the Nonni, but the soil seemed ordinary, a stark contrast to the decay around us. We ascended the hill, entering a nightmarish scene. Bodies in various stages of decay and mutilation lay in neat rows atop the soil. The meticulous nature of their wounds suggested a chilling precision behind their arrangement. The air was thick with the buzzing of flies, a grotesque soundtrack to the horror before us. As we approached the edge of the field, the man who had been haunting our radio since our arrival on the Noni appeared. He was a monstrous figure, dressed in tattered priestly robes, his skin marked by angry boils and patches of hair loss. A cloud of flies surrounded him as he lumbered across the dirt, his gait slow and methodical. His actions were revolting. He paused to inspect the bodies with an almost clinical interest before using an ice pick in a grotesque ritual. He seemed to be conversing with the maggots as if they were sentient beings, his tone one of pride and encouragement. Just as we were trying to process this macabre display, Sergeant Emery and a group of Marines burst onto the scene. Another group, led by Corporal McCready, joined them. They were poised for action, their sudden appearance a stark contrast to the eerie calm that had preceded them. As they took their positions, we realized the gravity of the situation we were in. We were not just witnesses to a horror aboard the Noni. We were now part of a conflict that was about to unfold in the heart of this floating nightmare. Sergeant Alden, in a mix of disbelief and urgency, echoed our need to evacuate the Noni. His statement was met with a sense of inevitability as he lamented our inability to communicate with the USS Barry and the jammed frequencies. He also mentioned a corpse garden in the back, a description that only fueled my rising anxiety. Curious and somewhat fearful, I asked about the garden, and Alden gestured towards the back of the ship where the Marines were conducting reconnaissance. Spoonie added in a shaky voice that there was something even more unnerving than the garden. Alden's skepticism was apparent, but as we began to describe what we had witnessed, his demeanor shifted from incredulous to concerned. Our conversation was interrupted by a faint, rhythmic pounding echoing from deep within the ship. The sound was unnerving, resembling a heartbeat emanating from the bowels of the vessel. Greta voiced our collective thought, suggesting the ship had a black heart. Alden, realizing the seriousness of our claims, stood up abruptly, deciding it was time to leave the Noni immediately. Yannick quickly followed Alden's lead, leaving us to make a quick decision on our next move. We opted to check the back of the ship, passing through what seemed to be a makeshift medical bay littered with medical supplies and a strange, unsettling symbol painted in what appeared to be dried blood. In the midst of the chaos, my attention was caught by an unopened bottle of oxy. The temptation was intense, but the urgency of our situation and the need to stay focused pulled me back. I rejoined my teammates, and we quickly exited the med bay. Outside, we were greeted by a bizarre scene. A makeshift farm with hills of soil extended from the door, stretching out to the walls of the deck. The soil looked ordinary, a stark contrast to the decay and horror surrounding us. As we ascended the hill, the extent of the horror became apparent. Bodies in various stages of decay and dissection lay atop the soil, a sight that was both chilling and surreal. The precision in their mutilation suggested a chilling, methodical approach. We reached the edge of the field and crouched down. Before us lay rows of corn, but it was unlike any corn I had ever seen. The corn was gray-blue, and the leaves and stalks were black with dark purple highlights. The voice we had heard over the radio was now close enough to be barely audible, spouting nonsensical religious babble. Leading the way, Greta assigned me the point position with Spoonie covering our back. Just as we prepared to enter the foliage, a Marine with camo face paint and a boonie hat signaled for us to stop and remain silent. The Marine, Kiefer, cautiously joined us, informing us that they had been following the deranged priest for a while and were about to take action. Kiefer's warning about a significant number of horseflies in the area where they were headed was both bizarre and unsettling. We continued through the black stalks of corn, the towering shape of the Noni's command bridge looming in the distance, obscured by the gray, swirling fog. As we reached the edge of the cornfield, the sight before us was shocking. The ground had been excavated, forming a steep slope that led to a dirt-filled valley running the width of the deck. The valley was flanked by heaps of horseflies, an unnerving sight that further added to the nightmarish atmosphere. Suddenly, the grotesque priest we had been hearing over the radio appeared. His appearance was as disturbing as his voice. Tall, obese, and dressed in tattered priest robes, his skin was a corpse-like white with angry red boils. He seemed to revel in his grotesque appearance, laughing maniacally as he approached Sergeant Emery and his men. Emery, reacting to the immediate threat, fired at the priest, but to our disbelief the bullet seemed to have no effect. The priest continued his charge, engulfing Emery in his massive arms. The other Marines, momentarily stunned, soon sprang into action, charging at the priest to rescue their sergeant. We watched in horror as the priest was knocked to the ground, only to rise again, seemingly unfazed by the bullets and physical blows. His giggle and playful demeanor were chilling as he squared off against the Marines, ready for a bizarre, grotesque boxing match. Corporal McCready, taking charge, prepared to confront the priest physically. Despite our warnings about the sinister revelations we had discovered, McCready was focused solely on subduing the priest. We watched, helplessly perched atop the hill, as McCready squared off against the priest in a surreal, disturbing confrontation. The priest's appearance and behavior were unnaturally menacing, his laughter and antics belying the danger he possessed. McCready, a formidable figure, seemed almost dwarfed by the sheer bizarre menace of the priest. We were left in a state of shock and disbelief, watching the unfolding confrontation with a mixture of horror and bewilderment. "Are you nuts?" Thompson yelled from where she was aiding Sergeant Amory, who was still reeling from his encounter with the priest. "That guy just shrugged off bullets like they were nothing." Her voice was tinged with disbelief and fear. McCready, not deterred, replied without turning back, "The hell he did." It seemed implausible, almost impossible, that someone could take multiple rounds and still stand, yet we had all seen it with our own eyes. The confrontation between McCready and the priest escalated quickly. The priest, grinning maniacally, closed the gap between them in a blur of motion. McCready, surprisingly agile for his size, managed to dodge the priest's attack and retaliate with a stun gun and baton. The electrical surge seemed to momentarily subdue the priest, sending him to the ground. As we watched, stunned, the mounds of horseflies suddenly erupted into the air, creating a deafening roar. Beneath them, dozens of grotesque figures, once hidden, were now exposed. These half-naked, swollen bodies, covered in angry welts and bulges of discolored flesh, began to twitch and shudder, then slowly rise to their feet. In shock, we watched as these towering figures, each at least 8 feet tall, stood upright, revealing their disturbing deformities. Their bodies were grotesquely augmented with chunks of flesh from humans and sea creatures, stitched onto their own skin in a macabre form of armor. As they began advancing towards us, we realized the severity of our situation. Armed with an assortment of rusty weapons, they moved slowly but determinedly. Their leader, a monstrous figure at least 9 feet tall, stood out among them. His body was draped in a patchwork of flesh, his head and face hidden behind a strip of what appeared to be shark meat, fashioned into a grotesque helmet with only small holes. MacCready, now face to face with the priest, was unfazed by his opponent's resilience. He engaged in a perilous dance of combat, striking the priest with precise blows. But as MacCready landed hit after hit, it became evident that the priest was not an ordinary adversary. His laughter, even in the face of injury, was chilling, his movements unpredictably swift. From our vantage point, we could see the chaos unfolding below. The Marines, initially caught off guard by the priest's unnatural abilities, regrouped and opened fire on the approaching horde of mutilated giants. Greta and I were halfway up the hill, dragging the still vomiting Sergeant Amory to safety, while Spoon provided covering fire with his machine gun. Despite the overwhelming firepower, the grotesque army pressed on, using their makeshift flesh armor to shield themselves from the barrage of bullets. One of the larger figures, moving faster than the rest, broke through the Marines' defense, causing disarray among the group covering our retreat. My heart pounded as I watched the scene unfold, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The grotesque giant, towering over the fray, was a nightmare come to life. His body was covered in the flesh of both man and sea creature, stitched together in a hideous display of human depravity. His face, hidden behind the shark flesh, was a blank, horrific mask, with only small holes for his eyes. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The Marines were fighting valiantly, but it was clear that we were outmatched by this nightmarish enemy. The thought of what might happen if they reached us was too terrifying to contemplate. We needed to escape, to get off this cursed ship before it was too late. But with each passing moment, our chances of survival seemed to diminish, swallowed up by the madness that had overtaken the Noni. Thompson's shout pierced the air, her disbelief echoing our own. That guy just shrugged off bullets like they were nothing. The incredulity in her voice matched the shock rippling through us. Even MacCready seemed unfazed by her exclamation, dismissing it with a confident retort as he faced off with the deranged priest. The scene unfolding before us was surreal. The priest, a grotesque figure, lunged towards MacCready with an unnerving swiftness. But MacCready was ready. In a split second, he deployed a taser and a stun baton, incapacitating the priest with a skilled combination of agility and tactical prowess. The electrical discharge convulsed the priest, sending him to the ground in a heap. Just as we thought the priest was subdued, the mounds of horseflies erupted into the sky in a deafening roar. Beneath them lay dozens of half-naked, grotesquely swollen figures. They began to stir, their bodies bulging unnaturally with stitched-on slabs of flesh from humans and sea creatures. It was a scene straight from a horror film. The Marines, realizing the enormity of the threat, redirected their fire towards these monstrous beings. The leader, a 9-foot giant clad in a patchwork of flesh, shrugged off bullets as if they were nothing. His laughter, chilling and manic, filled the air as he engaged with the Marines. One Marine, attempting to stop the giant, was effortlessly flung into the air and disappeared into the throng of advancing monstrosities. Panic set in as the Marines ordered a retreat, firing as they fell back. MacCready's voice cut through the chaos, urging us to head for the boats. Greta and I, along with the other Marines, scrambled up the hill, the sound of grenades exploding behind us, sending tremors through the ground. We dashed back through the black cornfield, the command bridge looming ominously in the distance. Suddenly a terrible deep moan resonated from below the deck, shaking it more violently than the grenades had. MacCready, bewildered by the chaos, struggled to comprehend our warning about something massive wearing the Noni like a shell. As we reached the makeshift med bay, 2 Marines covered our retreat. The sudden realization that Lieutenant Brisby and the others might still be aboard struck me. Gunfire and cries of pain echoed behind us as we fled the medbay, with MacCready planning to circle the Noni in search of the other boats. In the midst of the pandemonium, my gaze flicked to the bottle of pills on the counter. Even in the chaos, the lure of the oxy was undeniable, a disturbing reminder of the grip it still had on me. We rushed towards the exit, Greta and Spooner leading the way. But disaster struck as they stepped onto a corroded patch of the deck, which gave way under their weight. Greta managed to leap to safety, but Spoonie wasn't as lucky. He clung desperately to the edge of the newly formed pit. Ignoring MacCready's warning, I rushed to Spoonie's aid, determined to pull him to safety. But as I reached him, more of the deck collapsed, sending us plummeting into the darkness below. The rush of hot air and the roar of collapsing steel were the last things I remember before everything went black. Now, in the confines of a bag, I'm hastily wrapping up this account. I'll send this to my contact on the mainland and post again as soon as I can, if possible. This is McGuffey, signing off. For now.